of the last major sources of asbestos fibers for the world market. And the industry is really restricted to Quebec, and it only employs a few thousand people, but it has been vociferously and very vehemently supported by the Canadian government over the years, and continues to be supported. And it was the European Union, on behalf of France, that challenged Canada's sorry, the other way around. It was France put a law in place restricting or prohibiting imports of Canadian chrysotile asbestos. Canada then challenged that at the WTO, and yet that was upheld because, well, for a couple of reasons. The WTO dispute settlement body recognized the validity of the popular opposition, the genuinely felt sort of popular concerns about the health effects of asbestos among the French citizenry. But also it said that France had the right under the international trade architecture to make decisions that would otherwise violate the trade rules, to make decisions that restrict imports on the basis of an articulated health concern. So there are some counterexamples. On the other hand, from a Canadian perspective, if you look at NAFTA Chapter 11 arbitrations, for example, it really does represent a remarkable retreat from democratic governance in several respects. Stephen already mentioned some of them. Let me give you some others. Now, I don't want to repeat what you said, so I hope I can remember. You mentioned that these decisions on these cases are made by trade arbitrators, not within the Canadian democratic system, the courts or the legislatures. What is particularly significant about this, it's not just that these people generally have business or legal training and their expertise tends to be in international trade and international business. It's also that the entire system is set up with structural incentives for these people to give decisions that favor investors. Why is that? First of all, they rely on repeat business. They don't have anything like security of tenure that judges in the Canadian system have. So in order to get repeat business, they need to make sure that their interpretations of the international trade and investment rules are sufficiently favorable to investors that investors will continue to avail themselves of this dispute settlement mechanism. Secondly, they are appointed by the parties. So the way it usually works is that the investor appoints one arbitrator, the defendant government appoints a second arbitrator, and the two arbitrators then appoint a third. There are stories in the literature about senior judges. For instance, there's a story I've seen about an American senior appellate judge who was appointed by the American government to sit on a NAFTA Chapter 11 arbitral tribunal and then decide the case, and then to get pressure from the American government as to what decision to reach. So there can be direct pressure, it can also be more insidious as well. In general, there are no rules about conflict of interest for the arbitrators, so that it's not uncommon for the same person to be representing an investor who, in an arbitration where they're challenging government regulation, and at the same time be sitting as an arbitrator in another Chapter 11 case, and even at the same time beyond that, providing consulting or advisory services for investors or governments. this sort of thing would be absolutely inconceivable for a judge of a court. One thing that Stephen didn't mention is the very, very limited oversight of these processes by democratic institutions. So I'll just mention two things about that. First of all, it's extremely difficult to challenge one of these arbitral awards in a Canadian court. So an arbitration that goes against Canada, it's possible in theory to challenge it in a Canadian court, but the grounds to challenge it are very narrow. Really, there has to have been some kind of fraud or fundamental failure of due process, or the arbitrators must have exceeded the terms of the arbitration. They must have gone beyond what the dispute that was submitted to them. It isn't, for instance, a defense to say that the decision they reached is contrary to the explicitly expressed legislative policy of the Parliament of Canada, expressed either through legislation or otherwise. So the fact that it contravenes Canadian public policy is not sufficient. There is a public policy basis for challenging these awards, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean that you can challenge it in court by saying it's not consistent with Canadian legislation or Canadian public policy. It only means that it has to have been, as I said, a complete failure of due process involved. That's what's intended by public policy. And the second thing is that these decisions, once reached, take effect in the Canadian legal system, not just in the absence of some kind of legislative action by the government, but usually directly in spite of existing legislation. So the legislative organs, the parliament or the legislatures of the provinces have expressed themselves through the democratic process on a particular issue, and an investor will challenge that, and the arbitral award, if it succeeds, will in fact say that legislation is illegal under NAFTA, and compensation has to be paid. Oh, there's a third point about the sort of assault on democratic institutions, and that is there have been several Chapter 11 cases, a whole line of Chapter 11 cases where the actions that are challenged as being a violation of NAFTA include the routine activities of parliamentarians as parliamentarians. So, for instance, things that are said in parliamentary debates in Parliament or in a legislature are considered to be violations that require compensation. Similarly, media releases or statements to the press by government ministers outside Parliament are challenged in the sense that when the investor puts together their case and they list, here's all the evidence of the government action that violates my rights, it'll include those kinds of things. So the activities of elected representatives going about their business as elected representatives. Shall I hand it back to you to talk a little bit about what sort of opportunities there are for citizen engagement at the transnational level, and then maybe I'll have a few more things to say after that. Okay.
So we don't want to cast a total pall over the meeting, but let me, in a way, conclude a couple of things from what Stepan was saying. While it's true there's been a mobilizing effect of some of the global governance innovations like the WTO, and Stepan mentioned Seattle, I think basically it has been demobilizing because there's been a lot of Patricia Wood has been a